This video serves as an update to my Archmage Poison Crit Hexblast Acolyte of Chayula build that I introduced 2 weeks ago. Since then I've gotten all ascendancy points, cleared a citadel, cleared around 50 tier 15s and around 5 tier 16s at a boss difficulty of 3 and 4. I still need a much better weapon setup, but the damage is currently sitting at around 500 to 600,000 DPS with good uptime, and should hit 10 million DPS with more gem levels and spell damage, which should be achievable with about 30 divines more of investment. For those that didn't see the first video, this build utilises the high base damage of Hexblast, amplified by Archmage with a very large mana pool, running mind over matter for defences. This is a crit poison variation of the build, using Plague Finger, which enables all damage types to contribute to the magnitude of poison damage. Since poison now scales off of the final hit damage, before mitigation, it's best applied with crit damage, meaning we want as much crit bonus and as much poison magnitude as possible, both of which we can very easily get from the tree and jewels. For the strengths and weaknesses of this build, it has good damage and survivability at all stages of the game, though early single target can be a little bit low. It's a fun 2-button playstyle with no clear weaknesses and should be a solid league starter due to a good early mana sustain that you can achieve with Acolyte of Chayula. Its downsides are the clear isn't as good as the top clear speed builds at the moment, such as Archmage Spark, Ice Monk and several other bow builds, and there is a very high spirit demand for this build due to the necessity of running Blasphemy for Hexblast. This makes it harder to run powerful uniques such as Ghost Ride and the Everlasting Gaze, but this can be possible with further investment. Firstly, I'll talk about the skill setup. For Hexblast, I switched some supports around depending on whether or not I'm mapping or bossing. But the general mapping setup is to run Considered Casting, which gives a high amount of damage at a cost of a little bit less cast speed. Inspiration, Chaos Mastery and Arcane Tempo. And most likely Arcane Surge for the final slot once I eventually unlock that. But the last slot is it's a bit flexible. You can also run Electrocute, you can run Lightning Penetration for a bit more instantaneous hit damage. You can pretty much use whatever you want for the 6th slot. For bossing, we switch out Arcane Tempo for Concentrated Effect and Chaos Mastery for Deadly Poisons. If you have a 6th link, you can then add Comorbidity as the final support, which will give you an extra +1 poisons to your total poison count, bringing it up to 3 at least in my case. I haven't yet worked out if I should take an additional +1 poison on the tree and use Chaos Mastery instead of Comorbidity to give like an extra gem level, but for now this setup should work quite well. If you have very high cast speed in the super late game, you could experiment with using a 4 poison setup, which could bring the total DPS up to around 20 million. But maintaining 4 poison uptime would of course be quite tricky because it depends on your duration. Typical duration of a poison will be about 3 or 4 seconds in the late game, so you need to have a pretty high cast speed to keep that uptime nice and consistent. I personally think 3 poisons should be enough for most builds, but if you like, you can experiment with the 4 poison setup if you do so wish to. For late game poisons, it must be noted that poisons make up about 85% of total damage, so it's extremely important to have 3 of them active at all times on boss fights. And next we have Eye of Winter, which serves as many important purposes. I add chaos damage for the main reason here of being able to apply Withered. So the thing that I'm trying to achieve with Eye of Winter is Eye of Winter will rapidly give full stacks of Withered and critical weakness almost immediately. We pair this with Unleash, which basically just gives additional casts of the ability at the cost of damage, but we don't actually need damage because the purpose here is just to apply as many stacks of critical weakness and Withered as possible. You can see from the tooltip here that the Withered duration is 5.6 seconds, which is very nice because we run Persistence and of course Withered, which just needs 1 point of chaos damage to actually apply, by the way. So Eye Winter is a fantastic vehicle for being able to apply Withered very easily, and it also adds plus 10% base critical strike chance to your spells, and because Hexblast only has a 7% base crit chance, this is a gigantic multiplier, even more so if you're using a Blood Mage. When you're playing with Eye of Winter, the thing to note is that you want to cast one of these basically to every time your Withered is about to expire. In my setup, it currently lasts for about 5.4 seconds, so every 5 seconds or so you want to be casting another Eye of Winter, and you also want to make sure that your critical weakness uptime is at 100% so that you can keep applying critical poisons. For Blasphemy, I run Temporal Chains while mapping, but when I fight bosses I switch this out for Despair. I'm also currently using Magnified Effect. This is very, very important. Hexblast, sorry. Blasphemy doesn't have a very high base range, so if you combine it with Magnified Effect, you get a significantly larger range here, so this allows me to effectively cast Hexblast at a larger distance. Hexblast, if you don't detonate a curse on a target, will just kind of fall completely flaccid and flat and do nothing. You don't want to be a melee caster, so you want to make as much use of the range as possible. Now I will add that I've also added Impending Doom here. To be honest, I don't even know if this works. It does add 15% of my current mana to the overall skill spell damage, so that is quite nice. But it's a bit tricky to actually test whether or not this works. It seems to do something, but I don't really know how this works with the Hexblast scaling because it's not directly attached to my Hexblast, right? So I don't know if it actually gets benefits from the additional modifiers that I have from these skill gems here. But nevertheless, I've included it anyway. You can also add the 25% curse effect if you want to. It takes a bit of a spirit. It takes a bit of additional spirit because it actually has a bit of a cost here, and I can't use it at the moment because I currently only have 6 left. So I'd have to take off my mana remnants, and then I could maybe swap out Impending Doom for Magnified Effect. But I don't think it's really too necessary personally. Archmage is Archmage, not much to say here. Give it quality, give it gem levels as much as you can. That's pretty much that. Lots of nice damage. Now I have Conductivity here on the bar, which I've paired with Cursed Ground. Now I will say that Conductivity is not actually important at all as an ability to use. Since with this build we only really care about poisons, reducing enemy lightning resistance only applies to the hit damage of Hexblast, as poison magnitude is not actually dependent on the damage dealt post resistances. Reducing enemy lightning res to 0 only adds about 6% more DPS, which you would probably lose more of in the time it takes to actually cast Conductivity over another Hexblast. I only use this at the start of boss fights. Like I stack this up before a boss spawned. It just helps with some of the early hit damage, but I generally don't apply this more than once. You do not need to use Conductivity, but it gives a nice little bit of damage. If you want, you could put Conductivity here on your Blasphemy, which will make your hits while you're mapping a bit more powerful, because most of our damage of normal Hexblast does actually come from lightning damage. But I like Temporal Chains because it's just a bit better for quality of life. I'm currently running Mana Remnants. You don't need to run this, but it just kind of helps a little bit with your mana uptime. I don't have very high what do they call it? Overleach? I think it's called Overleach, right? I don't have very high Overleach when I use this because, you know, I'm not running a Spark build. I'm not killing shocked enemies that often. Typically, if I'm running around, I might have like 4k, 4.2k, something like that. But what Mana Remnants does is it just kind of allows us to keep our average sort of mana percentage at a very high level effectively. It's good for survivability. I quite like it, but you don't have to use this. If you want, you can take off Mana Remnants and maybe add in some like increased curse effect here. It's entirely up to you. And finally, to talk about, we have Mana Tempest and Sigil of Power, both of which are massive damage amplifiers, particularly Sigil of Power, which I use very regularly. I use Sigil of Power regularly for bosses, but I hardly ever use Mana Tempest. Mana Tempest is powerful. If you read the description for those that don't know, it adds 70% of damage with extra lightning damage, but it severely drains your mana almost immediately. Like for a quick little demonstration here, if I cast Sigil of Power and I use my Mana Tempest, watch as my mana goes down to almost 0 as I start casting things. There. Use this very, very cautiously, guys, and use this at your own risk, trust me. So now I'll talk a bit about the gear and the gearing process. I really like hitting 50% evasion in builds like this. It's just a very nice defensive layer. You can think of evasion as, so it's not going to affect the maximum sort of damage from a big hit that you're going to take, but while you're mapping, it does effectively reduce your incoming damage per second to yourself by 50% if you have at least 50% evasion. Better if you can get 75, but I don't think we're going to get 75 in this build. And having a good amount of evasion makes up for the fact that we're not running pure energy shield bases. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. For the weapons, you can either use a wand and a focus or a staff. It doesn't really matter because they both kind of give the same effects. The thing I would say is that if you buy a staff, like you only have to look at one item. but you do sort of increase the demands that you have very, very good rolls on your staff, which can be quite hard to get. Now, you can get like 250% spell damage on a staff, which is crazy, but you know, that's going to be quite expensive. At least if you have a wand and a focus, you can kind of split up some of the priorities between them, and it just increases the chance that you're going to get a good item. So it's a bit smoother to go with a wand and a focus. And I will say with a focus, you do get more mana, because you get more energy shield, and we are of course running Eldritch Battery. Now, on the actual wands themselves, or the staff if you choose to use one, the things you should prioritize are gem levels and spell damage, as I've done here. Spell damage is the king for DPS, and you'll see my current weapon is actually not very good. To be honest, I don't have any spell damage. I got a little bit of chaos, and I've got a decent amount of lightning on here, but no actual spell damage, so I'm in need of a pretty big upgrade. But my damage is still good quite currently. So I said that spell damage is the king for DPS, and that is true. It's the single biggest scaler for your damage because it scales your base damage, your damage is extra, all equivocally at the same time, rather than just scaling individual components of your damage, because we are using both chaos and lightning in this build. Now, even though spell damage is king, without gem levels you do start to get some diminishing returns after a while, so you do want to be aiming for as many gem levels as possible. Currently, with my current setup between these two, I have +5, but you can get that to +7, which would be a very, very nice damage increase. Do note that it does also spike your mana cost, and even mine at the moment is 347 mana per cast, which is pretty high, you must admit. Second of importance is to get as much mana as possible across all your gear in general. Mana is extremely important with an Archmage build, especially because we're running Mind Over Mana. Pretty straightforward to talk about in that regard. The next highest priority, and this one is actually quite crucial, but you have a bit of flexibility in how you get it, is crit chance. So we are running a crit version of the build, but you don't need to have super high crit with this build. Because we're running critical weakness, we have a base crit chance of 17% on our Hexblast, so we only need to increase this by a total of 200% in combination with both the weapons and the tree. I have about 100% on the tree, I've got just over 100% on the weapons, maybe a little bit more actually. Got some somewhere. Yeah, I've got some crit chance here, so I've actually got more than I need, but as long as you get 200% in total, it's fine. But it's very, very important to get to that level because you want to keep applying critical poisons as much as you can. And finally, there's cast speed. Cast speed is not super mandatory on this build, but it is very good for quality of life. You can add as much cast speed as you want to suit your own sort of taste and preferences. Now, you do actually want, I would say, at least 30% increased cast speed from both your weapon and the tree, at the very least, because you want your Hexblast to be very, very snappy, effectively. While you're mapping, you're running breaches, you want the Hexblast to come out fast, so it's like boom, 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 kill all the breach monsters. You don't want to be interrupted while you're casting and then just get swarmed by mobs immediately. So cast speed you can tailor to your own preferences. I do need to get a bit more, but my current amount is actually quite nice. Do note with cast speed, however, that the more you get, the more mana intensive it becomes. I did, in a previous video, emphasize that if you're having mana problems, it's very, very important to have high hit damage rather than cast rate. But once you start getting to the late game, you do need cast rate as well, just for pure quality of life purposes. And DPS. The armor process is actually quite simple. We use hybrid energy shield and evasion on most of our equipment. Well, actually, to be honest, it's only really the boots. I suppose you could count this as well. But one of the crucial components of this build is actually these gloves here, Plague Finger. What they do is, in addition to a nice bit of poison chance on hit, they say all damage from hits contributes to the magnitude of poisons. This means your Archmage contributes to your poison damage, which is then delivered as chaos damage, so these are extremely important for this build, and to be honest, in Path of Exile 2, pretty much any build should be using these gloves. Since poisons, as I mentioned, are 85% of your late game damage, you need these gloves for bosses, trust me. If you're using an Archmage setup, you do need to use these gloves. While I'm mapping, I actually run these gloves. You know, they give like 50% rarity, because while mapping you really don't need the gigantic damage because most of your mapping progress just comes from single hits anyway. So I switch this out while I'm mapping and then switch it back to bosses. I'm also running a Morior Invictus. This version I'm using maximum mana and spirit because both are extremely important in this build. Spirit is very important. You'll need at least 154 for this build to come online, but you probably want more in case you want any increased curse effect or you want to use any 30 Spirit auras like Mana Remnants, for example. I use Breach Rings as of course my rings, for the main reason being they give a gigantic amount of mana, 252 and 244, and both of these give 100% mana regeneration rate, which, you know, in the late game is very, very high. You see my mana regen now is over 300, and this is on an Acolyte of Chayula, not an Archmage, sorry, not a Stormweaver, so this is a pretty good value. The main reason why I like to run very high amounts of mana regeneration rate, even though I'm running an Acolyte of Chayula, is because sadly, in the late game, Into the Breach Blue Embers are very hard to pick up when you're surrounded by 100 Breach mobs. I intend to rant about Acolyte of Chayula later, but I'll leave that for further down in the video. You'll need around 40 Spirit or so from the Amulet. You also need quite a high amount of mana. Now you can run Recoup if you want to, but it's not really very good, or at least what I would say, Recoup isn't really worth the investment in my opinion. I tested 95% Recoup with the unique belt that gives about 50%, but what I found is that while I was just mapping, I was letting myself take large amounts of damage, but it was only giving me about 300 regen per second, and that was with the node, which shortens down your recoup time to 6.4 seconds instead of 8. So again, it's nice to have, but it's not really worth giving up an entire belt slot for. You also have to take, where is it? You also have to take this node on the tree, which, you know, it's a bit of a point investment. You can anoint it, but I don't really want to. Again, you can run Mana Leech, sorry. You can run Recoup, but I don't think it's too necessary. In my testing, it wasn't really very impactful. I actually recorded a video on this, and let me know if you want me to release that, but if you like, you can just take my word that Recoup is not really worth the investment right now, unless they change anything. This will be different on a Chronomancer. Recoup is very good on a Chronomancer. As for the belt, in the super late game, I intend to run a reasonably well-rolled Ingenuity, mainly for the reason I just boost these rings. But for now, this is just pretty basic. Life resistances, not really much more to say. Don't have any more charm slots at the moment, but you know, one is fine, and I just use a freezing charm for most purposes. I will add finally that if you have enough spirit from the chest, for example, if you get a 5-socket, very well-rolled spirit modifier on your Morio Invictus, then you could actually swap this amulet for an Everlasting Gaze. The Everlasting Gaze, of course, being a very powerful, very popular, unique item, which gives you quite a lot of energy shield based off 30% of your maximum mana, if it's well rolled. You could also get a bit more spirit from things like Corruption Implicits on your helmet. You could also get them from Grand Spectrums, although these are quite expensive. I don't run this setup currently, mainly due to the fact that this build does have quite high spirit demands, and also the fact that my current tree setup doesn't invest into anything regarding extra energy shield at the moment. I should take this as an opportunity to explain why I'm not running energy shield as like a sort of baseline defense, instead I'm using entirely an Eldritch Battery type setup. I think it is quite likely that Energy Shield, or at least Grim Feast, will be changed quite a bit in the coming weeks, as it is simply too strong relative to other defenses, particularly in the case of Grim Feast. To pivot into Energy Shield, I will have to take out some damage nodes from the tree and deselect Eldritch Battery. This would reduce my damage by quite a bit and force me to run Grim Feast to make up for the fact that the Energy Shield recharge rate in Path of Exile 2 is actually quite low. It's not a pivot I really want to make until I've seen Grinding Gear Games' stance on what they want to do with Energy Shield. As a compromise, I do intend to run the Everlasting Gaze when I can find more spirit, but in the meantime, this is what my current setup is. I will add that an Energy Shield version of this build would be significantly better defensively, so you can opt for Energy Shield if you want, but in my personal stance is I'm just going to wait a few weeks. My current mana value is more than enough for defensive layer, with a 50% evasion rating, and it's only going to get better as I get even more mana. I do still die every now and again, but it's usually due to being boxed in by mobs and things like Delirium, and well, everybody knows what Delirium is, right? We've all heard the complaints about Delirium. It's not the most, let's say, quality of life focused lead mechanic at the moment, and you do tend to get surrounded very, very quickly. But that being said, maybe the solution is I could run more spirit, and then I could use Blink And then blink would be a fantastic way of actually getting out of the main situations which cause my character to die. You know what, I'll test this and I'll let you know. Okay, so now it's time for the tree. Here I'll highlight the crucial nodes for this build and go over some flex options which you can choose or choose not to choose to suit your own personal preferences. I'll start with my current tree and then I'll talk a bit about the early game setup, which are a little bit different because it depends on relative power level at the time, that type of thing. Mind Over Matter, Eldritch Battery, and this node here, Arcane Intensity, are mandatory. These give a very, very large amount of damage and survivability, as is this cluster here, which gives extra effect of your, extra area or effect for your curses, which means your Hexblast has a much higher range to work with, and this is just very, very good for quality of life. You need this wheel here. This section with Chaos Gem levels, crit and poisons is very, very efficient. I like this quite a lot. This node here is actually quite cool, by the way. Just for a little bit of reference. So because poison always selects the highest damage hit which applied the poison, this is very good for your Eye of Winter. Because your Eye of Winter sends out so many hits, some of them will be critting, some of them won't. Your poisons will constantly be overwriting each other on a single cast, which means that you'll almost proc this to 100% pretty much immediately, which is very good when you start blasting people with Hexblast. Again, you always want to open combat by using Eye of Winter on a boss and then just keep spamming Hexblasts until effectively your critical weakness runs out. So this thing gives you very, very rapid stacks of duration very, very quickly. I think I can get mine to about 4 seconds right now, which is very, very nice. You might notice as well that I've also put quite a lot of points into jewels. I've got one here, here, here. I'll get these ones as well when I can. And the main reason is these jewels are extremely powerful in Path of Exile 2. Look at this one here, for example. This isn't even an optimized jewel, but it gives me 34% magnitude of poison and 7% poison chance on hit. And I have like tons of these things. I've got loads in my stash. I mean, just look at this, right? In the early game setup tree, I have this thing taken here, but look at this, right? We path here, we get 10% magnitude, 10% magnitude, 10%, and then 25%, right? So that is like 55% magnitude. Well, I get like 35 from a single jewel and other stuff. So like, I can save all these points and just put them into jewels instead and get even more magnitude. Like, this is so efficient. Like, jewels are fantastic in this game. I even made a video about it because I do think they're OP. They can linearly scale your damage. As mentioned earlier, I've gone for enough crit just to give me the 200% breakpoint. You get some crit and some crit bonus here. This is very efficient. You can take this if you want to. This is fantastic. Look at this, right? These 3 nodes here give you increased damage if you dealt a crit recently. So you get 30, 20, and then 20 again. So that is 70. And then you also get 36 from here, right? Your Eye of Winter will proc this immediately. So bam, 1 Eye of Winter, 100% increased damage straight away. Very efficient, very nice. There's also a bit here because these are very good for stats. You see this one here gives 35 bonus and 10 strength, bonus. I'll also take this as well if I need to. This gives me int and 25% crit chance. Just a very nice efficient node, and also means we can get this jewel socket here and even path to this one if we need to. And the rest of the tree is pretty much just making sure I can hit my evasion breakpoints and getting a bit of lightning damage here. I've currently gone for some intelligence at the moment, although this is more of a crutch. Now, I will add that I do not like this section. You see, this section is very, very ugly. We need to remove this. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 points that we can remove. And basically, I want to anoint this. This thing gives me 2 evasion rating for every 1 point of energy shield, which you can see is, I currently have 256 energy shield on my helmet. It's giving me like 500 evasion rating from 1 point, which is allowing me to go over the 50% threshold. So once I've got like a better amulet, I want to get a +3 amulet because you can get that fairly easily. Once I got a +3 amulet, I will anoint this node, remove these 9 points, and probably just put them into jewels like here, 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 etc. I'll probably do something like that, or I'll let you know what else I decide to do if it's anything crazy. Also, I take this node here because I just really value movement speed. Movement speed is really important in this game. When you have no movement skills, you need to move as much as possible. It just helps you avoid things, and it's a lot more fun. You can also take this here as well. This is quite a nice node. 3% movement speed, and you get a boatload of cast speed here. Very, very efficient and nice. You can also take this if you want. Sorry, this for another 3%. And another 3% if you have energy shield. On the topic of poisons, if anyone's wondering why I spend so much in poisons, the main reason is if you don't run both poison and crit simultaneously, I've done a calculation, I'll show you afterwards, that my damage would be 93% lower if I didn't use poison and crit. 93%. So if you find a Hexblast build that isn't using both poison and crit, it's probably very unoptimal, is what I would say. Personally, I would never play a Hexblast if I wasn't using both poison and crits. I think I would have a miserable time. So now onto the early skill tree, which I've used Maxroll to help me out with here. Thank you, Maxroll, for having such a well-designed passive tree. As you'll see, the sort of early tree is a little bit different, or actually quite a lot different. The main reason for the differences here is you want to put points into poisons quite early because you don't have the duels. For example, let's say you're in Act 4 or you're just starting maps and you want to have something which is effective early. You want to just take these poison things because they're going to be a big contributor to your DPS early on, right? So you want to take this node especially. This gives you an extra 1 poison. Of course, this one does here, so you can get 3 poisons quite easily. You don't need to take this if you don't want to be honest, but I would. I don't take this in the late game setup because it's only 53% chaos damage, but in the early game, before you have Archmage active, this is actually a very big damage increase. You can also pattern into this if you want to get some 15% reduced mana cost. I don't think this is necessary in my current setup with all the mana I have in the late game, but early on this is quite important. And also the crucial thing to think about when you're doing an early setup is you want to have as much mana leech as possible. This gives 25% plus 10% here, and you can also get 50% here. The main reason is the pacing of the early game and the early maps is a lot slower than later maps. So your Acolyte of, so your Into the Breach with your 14% mana leech is very, very useful because with these increased mana leech nodes, you can actually get it to over 100%. So each one of those blue embers will give you 30% mana. I actually like using this mechanic a lot, but the problem is once you start getting to like tier 10, tier 12 maps and you start opening breaches, the game is just too fast. We go from PoE 2 back to PoE 1, and PoE 1 requires a PoE 1 solution. You just don't have the time to walk around picking up blue embers in the late game maps. Like, you just don't. These mobs will not give you the opportunity to do that, so you need to stack very high mana regen in the late game. Just to even stand a chance. So unfortunately, you're early on, you can benefit from taking the blue embers. You can benefit from investing in the mana leech. It's very, very nice. You have the time to go and pick up the blue embers, but in the late game, you just really don't. Because you need to be nuking monsters instantly so you don't get overwhelmed and swarmed. Speaking of which, it's now time for my rant on the Acolyte of Chayula. Man, this ascendancy. This ascendancy is eclectic at best and confused at worst. Darkness is a terrible mechanic, outside of maybe a no-hit Sanctum run. Instant mana leech is just not necessary when you have Into the Breach with 14% mana per ember going up to 30%. Reality rending is nice for damage in theory, but when I actually calculated it myself, it's only giving me like a few percent extra to my like average DPS. And then there is Into the Breach. Oh boy. Into the Breach is the node which I have the most to talk about. Firstly, I'll say that if you're playing a melee build, this node is terrible, and watch, I'll show you why. Now, the embers are supposed to spawn every like 1.4 seconds, is it? 1.21 seconds. Oh, by the way, this skill has a quality bonus, and you can't actually apply GCPs to it, so this quality bonus does nothing, completely nothing. I hope they fix that. If you look, I have no embers around me, so if you're playing a melee character, you just want to be standing around attacking things, and they only appear on the outside of things, right? Look where these embers are. If I'm playing a melee character, how the hell am I supposed to know where these are and pick them up when I just want to be in the middle of action all the time? It's not so bad on a caster, because as you're walking around, you can kind of path around and pick them up as you're going. But if you're doing this in a melee character, you do not want to sacrifice uptime for mana sustain or health sustain. You just don't want to do it. It feels terrible. Not so bad on the caster, but it's very, very bad in the late game, especially for 2 ascendancy points. The game pace is simply too fast in the later maps, and you just do not have the time to go around picking up embers. Anyone who's played even one breach will tell you how little time you have to actually make an impact. You need snappy, immediate damage, bam, bam, bam. And if you start taking damage yourself, it's too late. You get such little value out of mana leech at this point that it's better to go for 200% mana regen and have as much total mana as possible. Now, Into the Breach could be a fantastic ascendancy node. Numerically, it's great, but its problems are entirely based around the practicalities, as I've just showcased. My suggestion to GGG, if even at the 0.1% chance that a guy from GGG is even watching this video, of a microscopic entity such as myself, my advice would be that you either need to increase the pickup radius at which you can get these embers so that they kind of home into your character, like we're playing a platformer. Or you could spawn the embers much closer to your own actual character, so instead of spawning here, they spawn like here, which would be much better for a melee build. Or you could introduce a mechanic whereby if you have frequent monster kills or hits on an enemy, they spawn more embers around your character. This would at least allow you to keep the combat nice and fast and snappy, so that you're incentivized to do as much damage as possible because you're leeching as much resources as you can from this 2 ascendancy point or 4 ascendancy point investment mechanic. So this should be as good as it could possibly be. And the final point, which I would argue would make this amazing, but it may be too overpowered, would be you could allow the Flames of Chayula to have some kind of overleech mechanic, which would be, to be honest, fucking amazing. And it would arguably make the Acolyte of Chayula the best ascendancy in the game, particularly for like an SSFHC type environment. But right now, this ascendancy completely lacks identity, and it sits close to the bottom of the power rankings. It's a shame that my best node is in fact this, 85% chaos, maximum chaos resistance, and now 85%, and I get double chaos res. It's very good for early survivability, but I mean, look, I've invested 4 points into this and I'm getting basically nothing, and there's nothing else to select. I need my spirit, I can't take that. Instant mana leech, I don't have any mana leech. Well, I do, but it doesn't need to be instant. What's the point? And then this, I don't even use energy shield, and this is just a little bit of damage. It's not even that much. Like, it needs some love, guys. We need to do something here, and we could make this so much more powerful, and everything comes down to Into the Breach. Please just do something to make this, the quality of life of this, a little bit better, and I would love it if they added overleech, but that would be a bit too much, maybe. I honestly think that with some of these changes, the buffs could make this ascendancy go from maybe like, say, this build go from maybe like a high B tier to maybe an S tier if we just made the ascendancy itself a little bit stronger. As it currently stands, this build is significantly better on a Blood Mage because you have like 15% base crit, which you get plus 10 with your Eye of Winter. It goes to 25% and you can hit crit cap pretty easily. And also a Gemling Legionnaire is probably better for high end. I'm using Chayula on the hope that GGG give this class some love and it becomes significantly better in the next few weeks. But just do note that some other ascendancies would be better for this build. And it's not too hard to convert the tree to account for those different ascendancies. And finally, sorry for the flashbang, we come to my favourite part, which is my damage calculations, or as I like to call it, POB at home. So since we don't have POB, I effectively made my own, specifically for my current setup and for Hexblast. I've tested the actual calculations that I provided here against my in-game DPS, and you might see from some of the earlier videos, particularly on the Citadel boss, that I was able to get about 500, 600k DPS, which pretty much lines up with this value here, but I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. Well, I'll just basically explain the calculations. Look at some of my notes here. I've not included Impending Doom because, again, I don't know if it works. I'm assuming that I have 120% spell damage from my 4k mana pool on that passive node we talked about, 100 chaos from the tree, etc. Yeah, 200% spell damage from items. I think this is reasonable. Remaining spell damage just from the tree and all the additional modifiers. And of course, I can probably get my mana higher tthan 4k. I've seen 8k in some builds. I note here that we don't need like excessive lightning exposure. I haven't included Mana Tempest, and Gemling Legionnaire and Blood Mage are probably better. Okay. For those that are actually interested, God bless your soul, we'll talk about this. So the way I calculated this is we take the base damage of Hexblast at level 34, which is what I think we can realistically get to. We combine that with the damages extra modifier from Archmage, which again, at 4k mana, it's like a 3.6 multiplier, with 3 Flames of Chayula, with an average proc of Reality Rending, which gives our base damage. This is scaled by our modifiers, so we have our spell damage, chaos and lightning damage. This is why spell damage is king, because I've tested this, it applies to everything. We apply all these multipliers individually and we get our increased damage based off our initial modifiers. Now, the Hexblast does have a quality multiplier, which is 20% more chaos. Fair enough. 20% more applied to these values, not the Archmage here. And then we get this in combination with our more multipliers, which we have from Considered Casting, Concentrate Effect, and 2 stacks of Sigil of Power. And this will give our base damage plus our more increases plus our increased damage increases, which would give us to about 201,000 damage on a typical hit. Now we have to actually reduce this value due to deadly poisons. Now what deadly poisons does is it magnifies the magnitude of your poisons by 75% more at the cost of 25% less hit damage. By the way, if you only have 1 poison, this is terrible. If you have 3, it's fantastic. And this will give us our average hit damage. Okay, now I said that we use 50% crit chance, so we have to consider how crit works in the average calculation. So at 600% crit multiplier, this means our typical multiplier to our damage is multiplied by 4, because you can think of this as 50% 600, that's like 100% of 300, which is a 4 times multiplier, and that's our typical average damage. And then to work out our damage per second, we multiply that by the hit rate, which in this case, we're going to assume 2. 2 casts per second is pretty reasonable, it's not hard to get. So this will give us 1.21 million DPS, okay? Now the poisons come into play. So I think we can get 300% magnitude from the tree and gems. I already have 200, so I only need 100 more. With 3 poisons, and then we multiply this by the crit value. So the way poison works, as I mentioned, is it takes the highest damage hit which you've dealt, and then applies that over the poison duration, which is, by base, it's 2 seconds, but you can get it to 4 seconds quite easily, and it'll apply that value every second. So if you do a big crit, it'll take the value of that crit, multiply it by your poison magnitude, and this it's 1.4, so we actually get increased damage, multiply by the number of poisons, which gives us 4.444 million damage per second. And this is before any mitigation. So when you combine the hit damage plus the poison damage, you get 5.6 million DPS. And then you have to count in the enemy mitigation modifiers. So we are running Withered plus Shock plus 0% Chaos Res because of Despair. I think I can get Withered to 80%, so let's assume this will be a 2.2 damage multiplier overall. This gives our poison DPS of almost 9 million. It's a gigantic percentage on a 34 base. Hit damage, it's a little bit different because we're mixing lightning and chaos, so they get applied differently. The chaos is the same as the poison, so that's multiplied by 2, fair enough. The lightning is multiplied by, I'm assuming that I'm going to be using conductivity and bringing the base resistance down to 0, and then applying shock, which will give like a 1.2 damage multiplier overall. But to be honest, like the reason why I say you don't have to think too much about lightning penetration is if I assume there's no lightning penetration whatsoever, and this hit is being resisted by 50% lightning res on the enemy, it brings down my average DPS from 10,500,000 to like 10 million. It's like 6% more damage, guys. Like, you know, it's just not that much. I wouldn't worry too much about this if you don't want to. Like, yeah, you can run some lightning penetration if you want to for a little bit extra damage. It will make like your hit a bit stronger, but you know, it's not really too necessary. Now, if we applied these same calculations to a level 37, which would be like completely bis, maxed out, corrupted, full gem level investment, which I wouldn't really recommend because then you would have to wear the helmet, which gives you like +1 level, and for the sake of damage, I don't think it's that necessary. But if you do the same calculations here, you get to just under 15 million DPS. So I think this is a very realistic range. Maybe not this one, but we can see. You can get at least 10 million is what I would say. When I applied this to my current setup, so I'm currently using 3.5k mana, much lower spell damage modifiers, 2 poisons, lower magnitude, etc, etc, you get the point, right? It brings down my damage calculation at a maximum with 100% uptime at about 657k, 658k, something like that. But in some of my testing, I didn't use any Flames of Chayula, and let's assume that I also didn't get a reality rending proc because most bosses only have 3 million life, they die in like 4 or 5 hits anyway, so it brings my DPS to like 6 million, so, sorry, 600,000. I calculated about 500, 600k, so from what I can tell, this calculation looks to be pretty accurate. Not 100% of course, because I'm sure I'm missing something, like a decimal point here and there, but It's very, very close. It's very, very close to actual DPS. Now, you'll never actually get this reality in practice because it assumes you're hitting like a very large number of times without moving, without the boss moving, without missing anything, or, you know, just like taking a midpoint value of all of your damage rather than being, you know, damage is applied to the variance, right? It goes low, it goes high, and I'm assuming the midpoint here, so there's always going to be a bit of a difference. So I think this calculation is pretty accurate, and I'm going to use this to extrapolate my values in the late game. And that is pretty much that. Again, I quite like this build. I'm going to continue scaling it until I've beaten pretty much all the pinnacle bosses. I've got a few to go. As you can see, I've got all the points here, but I don't actually have any points in Breach at the moment. I need to play more, basically. I haven't had much time at the moment, so, well, that's pretty much that. I hope you guys have a good new year. Also got to all my detto. Happy New Year, all the rest of it. And yeah, see you all later. Bye-bye.